Hi fam, welcome to a new season of Budun Sukkar and it's our first episode for season 4. So this season something will change because I am changing. So what will happen is after 10 years of corporate, I decided to pursue like a career shift or a change in what I'm doing and all of that. I decided to be or become a trauma recovery coach. So what I want to do with this podcast is to share my learning journey along with you because I think there's a lot of things that we need to learn and unlearn in journey of finding our true self and building a life that we should love. Because let's be honest, sometimes we lead lives we don't really like. So let's start from scratch. The foundation. Trauma recovery coaching is about helping people who have survived trauma craft and fall in love with the life that they lead and stop allowing trauma to take over their life. And what I wanted to do today with episode number 1 is talk about the true definition of trauma. I know that I feel, and a lot of people feel like suddenly trauma is trending. And to be honest, you know what TikTok says? Not that I like TikTok, but you know what it says? Hashtag trauma dumping, which is when creators talk about their trauma in story time or whatever in a way to process it. Garnered around 200 million views. And hashtag trauma, 31 billion views. So it is kind of everywhere. So what is it really? And I don't want to trivialize it because a lot of people, including myself, have gone through trauma. So first of all, trauma, I know when we see Westerners talk about trauma versus when we say trauma is completely different, but trauma is not what happened. It's what happened to you after whatever happened. And this is where the nonsense usually happens because we start calling everything trauma: a bad interview, a bad job, a bad manager, a bad breakup, a bad day, and this is why we block people from really understanding when something truly bad and traumatic happened and block them from seeking help because we trivialized it so much. So could we stop doing that now? Thank you. So let's go into it. Let's do a deep dive in corporate language. Trauma is a psychological, emotional response to an event or an experience that is completely distressing or disturbing. It occurs or it happens when you go through an attack or abandonment that triggers a physiological reaction, which what you know, and I'm sure you've heard of, is flight or fight responses, which is really a hormonal reaction to something. But the problem is, yes, we can go like we almost have an accident or, we go through a stupid, embarrassing event and we feel all of these things and we just want to hide somewhere. But it's not about just that. It's about how long did it take for these feelings to subside. It could be days, it could be hours, it could be decades. A lot of people sometimes, because of these traumatic events, they keep living in that state. And this is where the whole, I need to regulate my nervous system comes from. And it's happening a lot because more and more people finding out that they're still living in that state and it impacts everything and their everyday. So what else makes it unique is that when people go through trauma, they feel intense fear, helplessness, or horror. And helplessness is something I am very, unfortunately, very aware of and felt it throughout my childhood living the way I lived. So helplessness and powerlessness is a very, very big part of what makes a trauma. There are 2 types of trauma, actually. One is the chronic little trauma, which happens throughout a long time, such as abuse, bullying, poverty, attack on your religiousness or spirituality, neglect, which is, let's be honest, we have a lot of neglect in the region. And the other one, the easy one, let's say, it's the big one, where it's usually one big event. Unfortunately, it could be an accident, someone's death, it could be a natural disaster, it could be some random violence, bout of violence, sexual assault. Unfortunately, those are easier to dub. And I feel those get more serious implication than the other one, but they're both as important. But I think what gets lost in translation is we undermine how you get traumatized. So what does that mean? Trauma is actually something that could have directly happened to you. You could have witnessed it, or you could have learned about it. So my question to you or to us is, are we getting traumatized by what's happening since October 7th? Seeing this on our phone unfolding, witnessing it firsthand in such blood and gore that we haven't seen it before. We've known about it, we've heard about it, but we've never seen it in such graphic manner. Especially that there are people that sound like us, look like us, live like us. What are we doing about it? Another thing about trauma is that it has elements. There are 3 elements. As I said earlier, powerlessness. The individual feel like they're powerless to control their circumstances, and it gets worse if you're not allowed to act. So for example, let's say you went through an earthquake and you couldn't move, you couldn't run. This traps the trauma even longer in your body. The second one is this a massive sense of fright or moral injury. It's a new word I learned. You know what moral injury means? It means you saw something or something happened to you that fundamentally goes against what you believe is right. Again, back to October 7th, back to our countries, our environment, where we are so brought up in such a conservative state that no one is allowed to make mistakes and no one is allowed to be unholy. Let's call it that way. But what happens when we see our role model act in unholy ways? What about honor killings? What about when it's our brother committing honor killings? What about that? Lastly, the circumstances or the event change the way you believe about your self-beliefs, about how you see yourself, about how you interact with the world. So for example, if you're bullied by your parent and your parent made you believe that you are not worth it, you believe you're not worth it, and then you marry people who believe you're not worth it, go into jobs you believe you're not worthy, and give yourself the least breadcrumbs. Let's be honest, that's what happens. So I know all of these things, people have felt it at some point of their life. If you felt it, don't ignore it. I know a lot of people believe that trauma just started picking up. You know, we see all these famous people talking about trauma like they just found about it yesterday. But in reality, the actual study of it started after World War I, where they saw that the warriors or people men coming back from war could not live beyond the war. They've changed, they become someone else. They started living in panic attacks. They lived in violence, they became someone else, and no one understood why. But actually, the studies showed that it started way longer than that. It started, one of the first or earliest conversations about trauma has been in Darwin's work. It's an often neglected book about emotional state of humans versus beasts or animals. And he was talking about that there are systems in our body that detects trauma, and trauma can be felt physiologically in your body and it stays there. So reality, it's been there for a while. I think it's about time that we take it seriously and not trivialize it and provide access to help. So what makes trauma really worse? Because, you know, there are degrees of trauma or dangerousness of trauma, you know. So number 1, human caused. So it's not versus natural disaster. Number 2, repeated. Number 3, unpredictable. Number 4, multifaceted. So it can happen in different ways. Let's say you're with a family and you get physical abuse, you get verbal abuse, you get sexually abused. Number 5, sadistic. Number 6, happen in childhood. Number 7, done by someone you trust, a caregiver. So as you go down the list, the risk grows bigger, because you know what they found about childhood? They found that when kids get exposed to trauma in childhood, it impacts and alters the way their brain develops. So when you see someone react in a very weird way, where you think, what's wrong with this person? Think, what happened to this person? So why do we care? Really? Why is it important? Why is everyone talking about it? Why is everyone suddenly healing their gut, healing their anti-inflammatory system, healing their nervous system, doing ayahuasca and doing everything else? Because trauma survivors live in their trauma. And that's something I lived in for such a long time, where I've always lived in the past. I was what I called myself, or I dubbed myself, a walking time bomb. And that was when I was 13. So what happens is, it doesn't let you have good quality of life because you're so busy living in it that you cannot move away from it. And then it impacts your body, you know? So what they found is People who are trauma survivors or went through trauma have chronic fatigue, chronic migraine, headaches, similar, but not, IBS, eating disorders. I've had eating disorders my entire life, asthma. They found people with trauma have 50 times the rate of asthma than people who didn't have trauma. Coincidence? I think one thing that we don't really take seriously is the coping mechanism that these trauma survivors picked up. A lot of them have to do with hypervigilance, disassociation, avoidance, numbing. That leads into drug addiction, alcohol addiction, people pleasing, so many things that make you out of control from your life. Make something else controls your life because you're so busy coping and running away from what happened to you. And this, I think, could even be worse than what is physiologically not okay with you. And as I'm going with this trauma recovery certificate, what I loved and I resonated with the most is the fundamental and key to healing trauma or starting addressing it is safety. Whether it was mentioned in the book, The Body Keeps a Score, or throughout my program, it's about having a safe space where people can speak and express about their trauma is key to start the healing process, because without it, you will not move forward. And what is safety? Safety is about allowing people to not feel the shame that is attached to their trauma, to their experience, because of the things that they couldn't do, they weren't allowed to, and the things that made them do. And safety is the first place. The second place is actually mindfulness. Without these two, you cannot move ahead. Why mindfulness? Because what they found is studies have found that people who go through trauma tend to be so disconnected from their body. Sometimes they cannot feel physiological things. And I remember saying this a lot, like, I see my feelings, I can't feel them. So once they found that people altered their reality, they couldn't feel their feelings, there was no way to move forward. They can't feel their trauma. And also what they found, they did this MRI brain scans when it first started in the 90s. They did an experiment on 8 people and made them relive their trauma. What they saw is the language and thinking centers in the brain shut down. You cannot think straight. You cannot speak straight. That's why sometimes just talk therapy does not work. You have to find ways to be more mindful, to be more grounding, to play, and to have other ways to bring the trauma out. Then talk therapy comes into play. So what I'm trying to say is there's so many different ways to heal. And I want to move away. I want to remove what is trendy from what is real. And this is the whole objective of this season, is to help you learn with me what is trauma, and if you're going through it, you're not alone, and there are avenues to help you do it. And hopefully I'll be able to be one of those avenues at some point. But honestly, the more I'm learning, the more I'm learning about trauma, the more I'm seeing how it impacted my life, how it crafted my life, because I had my own, because my family went through so much. As Arabs, we had underage marriages from my grandmother and then my mother. And we had forced marriages in both, and across all my families, we are full of divorces because of that. We are full of immature parents and narcissistic parents that should not and shouldn't have been parents. And then we are taking the brunt of it. And that doesn't end there. You know, I lived in a very unsafe childhood. There's a lot of neglect, and I lived with a lot of pain. And that's not a way to live. And I don't want anyone to live like that. And what we do as Arabs is we minimize it so much because we're so scared to name our feelings. And that's one of the key ways to also heal, is to start naming the way we feel in our bodies and the way things make us feel. And what I noticed with Arabs is we run away from that. You know, when I start labeling things in my family, I get shut down. They say you're making a big thing, you're making a scene. You know, you're exaggerating. I'm done. I'm not exaggerating. I went through something painful. Most likely you did. I did not recover, and I need to recover. So I'll keep it short. I know this episode is heavy. It's about trauma. It's not fun. But it can be once we learn about it and get better. Your body will never forget. You shouldn't forget either. If you don't address it, your body will. So let me know if you want to hear more about definitions, studies about trauma recovery, about coping mechanism, about how can we heal. I'm more than happy to continue sharing you with this. And I welcome myself to my new season, and I welcome you to stay with me in my journey. Thank you.